Yo guys, and welcome back to another video on this channel. This is in fact going to be the last video of this series, and today we're going to finish up with creating an actual edit view. So you can't actually create or edit quizzes, which is kind of important if you are a teacher and you would like to use this application. So today we're making a quiz editor and adding some finishing touches to make sure everything looks pretty and works well. So I will be adding an edit view, and this edit view will be for a specific quiz. So if we go to our host view here, we can see that we have this nice little quiz and we can also host it, but we would also like to be able to edit it. So we're going to add an edit view where we pass in a quiz ID that we want to edit. And this is something we can do with Svelte SPA router as well. We can actually add params to our routes and then get access to that value. So this is how this will look. We will just add like a normal route, but then we'll use this colon here to denote that this is going to be a parameter. This parameter we give the name quiz ID. So whenever we visit something like edit / something, whatever we have here is going to be the quiz ID. And then we will simply render this component. So I created this view, edit quiz view, and this is how this works. We simply take in a prop. So we have a prop, we need to call this params, and this will just simply be an object of all the properties of all the params that we have in our route. In our case, we called it quiz ID, so we simply need to use that name here as well. But then we can show that here, we can display that on the screen. So whatever I put here, we can see is now being rendered here, so clearly it's working. So what we're going to do here is actually make a HTTP request to our backend to fetch a quiz by its ID. So we currently have a route to fetch all the quizzes in our database, but that's not what we want to do here. We want to target a specific quiz ID which we want to fetch the data for. So we're going to use that params quiz ID and then send a HTTP request to our backend to get a quiz by its ID. So I'm also going to structure this by creating an API service. So this is where we will make our fetch requests to our backend. So I created a new class here called API service with two methods, get quiz by ID and our old get quizzes method that we had previously. So now we can use that as well, but we also have this new get quiz by ID. And this will be the same thing. We will have API quizzes, and then after that we will just specify a specific quiz ID that we want to fetch. And then we just return that quiz or null. And now, since I exported this API service here, we can also use it in our previous host quiz list view to get all the quizzes. So here I'm also going to use that immediately invoked function. I simply create this anonymous function here, which I need to make async since I want to use this await keyword. But then I simply call this function immediately. So this will be ran whenever we simply fetch this script and interpret this script. So whenever that happens, we just run this and we get the quiz by the ID that we have specified in the route. Now, in order for this to work, we also need to define this in our backend. So let's go ahead and do that. So the syntax for defining a route with a param is actually the same here in our Fiber backend. So this is a pretty common way of doing this. We just specify this param with the name quiz ID, and we bind that to get quiz by ID, which I defined. And what kind of fun stuff happens here? Well, we get the param by the name that we specified here in the route. And then we need to actually decode this into a primitive object ID. So this is coming in as a string, but we want it to be that primitive object ID type. So we try to parse that. If there is an error, then we return bad request. Otherwise, we try to fetch the quiz by its ID. And here I actually noticed I'm not actually doing this properly. So if quiz is nil here, we actually want to return status not found. But otherwise, if there's an error, we return the error. Otherwise, we return the JSON of that quiz object. Now to the quiz service, we just simply forward that to the quiz collection, get quiz by ID. And what happens here? Well, it's pretty straightforward. We find one this time. So we find one instead of finding all. We have this filtering here where we get one by its ID. And we decode it into a quiz here. If there's an error, we return the error. Otherwise, we return a pointer. So that should hopefully work. So let's see if I try to stringify this. It will make a HTTP request, and we can see that this is actually a bad request since this is an invalid primitive object ID. But let's add a button here so that we can edit a quiz here. So here I just added another secondary container, which is also a flex container, where we add a gap between these two buttons, our custom button component. And here I actually use a function that comes from Svelte SPA router called push. And this will simply navigate to a new page programmatically without the user having to do anything. So we'll just force them to another route. So let's try this. If I press this edit here, boom, we can see that we get the JSON. And we can also see that we make a successful HTTP request. And yeah, we're getting the same JSON here. So let's make an if statement here, check if quiz isn't null, and that will display something here. Else we display quiz not found, so this one was not found. If we make it 7, we can see quiz since that actually exists. Now the way I'm thinking here is that we have some sort of sidebar here where we will have all of the quiz questions. So all of the quiz questions, you can click them, and then we will have like a main view here where you can see the choices. You can also see the question name, and you can also have like some sort of top bar here with the name of the quiz, maybe a save button, the ability to add new questions, delete questions, and stuff like that. So let's go ahead and implement that. So we're going to need something like this, a selected question variable. And this is simply the current selected question, and this will be null by default. So I'm starting out by making this top bar here, and here we'll simply have this input field. This will be the quiz name, and then we will have a save button where we can save it, and we'll make a HTTP request to save it. But the main takeaway here is that we do bind value. So we bind the value here to the quiz name. So whenever I write something in this field, because of two-way data binding, whatever I write here will actually be set in the object as well. So we will modify this quiz object. So I'm going to define a new component as well called edit sidebar, which will be this sidebar with the questions. It will just be a flex container, flex with direction column. We have gap 2, set a little width here, make sure it's the width of the screen, or make sure it's the height of the screen, and a little bit different background color. So there we have that. I also added a flex container since we want to have first the sidebar here to the left and then some other content. So we'll use Flexbox for that. But we add an edit sidebar, and we can see that we have our items. I also made them p tags, but we can see that that kind of works. So I'm going to define a new component also, sidebar item, and this will be an item in the sidebar. It will simply be a button that the user can click to select that as the selected question. It will have background color white, a bit of rounding, a bit of padding, some border, also a little hover effect, but we also have this border color, and this border color will be dependent on if it is selected or not. So if it is the selected question, so we take in the question that this sidebar item is responsible for rendering, and then we send in the global selected question. So this is the global selected question of all the selected questions, and then we check, is this question ID that I'm supposed to render the same as the selected question? Then we show the border gray 500. Otherwise we don't show any border color except for the default here. And then we also added on click here. So whenever you click this button, we will simply set the selected question to the current question. So this will let us change the selected question inside of this sidebar item. So in order for this to work, we also need to bind the questions. And this is important that we use two-way data binding here so that we actually modify these values instead of just setting them locally. So whenever I change the selected question here, it will actually change this variable that I have here. And now we can see that that works. So now I can also select them. We can see them here. What is 2 plus 2? What is 404? And we can see that all of that kind of works. We can select the question. Nothing interesting happens here yet since we haven't added that. So I defined a new component here, edit question. And we simply check if selected question isn't null, Then we render this edit question component. Nothing interesting happening here yet. We're just taking a prop of the selected question and we stringify that. So let's try it. Boom, you can see that kind of worked. I'm not sure what happened with the width though. Okay, so I changed this width here to a min width so that we really tell Flex that, hey, you shouldn't resize this. It should always be at least minimum width of 64. So now you can see that works a bit better. So what I want to do is actually mimic the user interface that we have for the play view when we actually have choices here and we can see some image in the middle, a clock and the name here. It would be pretty nice if we could have like a website builder where what you see is what you get kind of vibe, where you can see the choices and edit them and, you know, see everything like it would kind of look if you were to play the game. So I'm gonna try to design something like that now. So this is pretty much what I came up with, pretty much code, but it's very similar to what we had in the play view. It's kind of different though, so I'm not really sure if we could make like a component out of it. We could definitely make some part of it. We could definitely make some parts of it more components and reuse them, but for now mostly copy paste this. So what we have here is just a lot of padding we add with full flex 1. This then will be the actual interface. So we have first some padding around it, and then we have the actual box that we can see in here. And this will simply take up most of the space. This will be another flex container where we have a column layout. So first in this column layout comes this header, next comes this middle part, and then at the bottom here we have our choices. So that is our column layout here. So for this header then we just add, of course we also make it a flex container. We set a different background color here a bit. We make item center, add a border B here for the bottom border. We add a bit of padding, justify between. So this is kind of a hack, but I want to center this input field in the middle here and still have content on both sides. So I think the easiest way to do this is by adding some dummy container here with a fixed width. So we have fixed width of 32. Fixed width of 32 here as well, and then an input field in the middle. So this will simply space them evenly, add the space evenly between the items in the flex container. So in the middle we will have this input field, which is what is 2 plus 2, which is the selected question dot name. So here as well we bind the value to the selected question, and since this is two-way data binding, we are going to change in the actual object, in the actual quiz object that we have fetched from the backend. We're going to change that directly. So back in edit quiz view we will have an updated quiz object which we can very easily send off to the backend again. We don't need to add any extra logic where we set the value to something else when it changes. We simply bind the value. So this is really powerful usage of two-way data binding. And then to the right here we can see that we have a delete button for deleting this question. Then in the middle we just have a simple little placeholder image, nothing fancy going on there. And then at the bottom we have our beloved quiz choice cards as well, but they have been upgraded a little bit. So first we start with px14 to add padding horizontally, but then we also add an input field. So instead of just showing text here, we let the user actually change the value of this choice, the name of this choice. So here they can edit this, and of course we use two-way data binding. So we bind the value here to select the question, the choice here, we get the index from this each loop here. So we bind that to the name of the choice. So when I update this, it will also update in the quiz object. And then after that, since this is in a flex container, I added a checkbox next to it where we bind the checked attribute. So it will also change in the quiz object. Whenever I press this correct boolean here, our correct property of this object will be updated. So let's also implement this on the delete button. I think we're going to talk to the parent component here and say that we have deleted this specific the current selected question. So we're gonna use events for that, creating a custom event dispatcher, something like this, where we just dispatch delete. So here we will simply add on question delete, and we add this event handler on delete. So when this runs, we check quiz isn't null, then we filter the questions based on the selected question. So there will only be one question that we are deleting, and it's going to be the selected question, since you can't really delete any of them if you haven't clicked in on them. We filter out that selected question, and we also set the selected question to be null so that nothing is selected anymore. So let's try that. If I press delete, boom, we can see that it vanished. We see nothing here, and it also vanished from the list. So something that you might have noticed if you try this is that we try to edit this, it won't actually update here. And that is because, well, it will update the actual object, but Svelte will not have known that this specific quiz was updated. So what Svelte listens to here is actually this quiz variable that we have. And Svelte doesn't know that it has updated since we are so deeply nested inside of it. So what we need to do here is a little bit, it's a Svelte quirk, so to speak. So whenever this value changes here, we're simply going to forward that to the parent component on change. So in edit quiz, we can do something like this. So on change quiz equals quiz. This looks a bit silly, but this quiz actually contains the updated value. And since we use an assignment, we simply say to Svelte, hey, something has changed. It's time to update and show that new value. So let's try that. What is 2 plus 2? If we change it to what is 4 plus 4, and I press enter, we can see that updated, so it works. Now we can also see that all of this persists, of course. If I add 4,000 here, I uncheck that and check that, and I click this and I go back, we can see that of course these values are persisted. I think it would also be nice if we could change the time limit for a question. Let's say if we have like a really tough question, what is maybe what is 1337 times 666 or something? Maybe a bit more time required than for example, what is 2 plus 2? So questions have different time limits. It would be nice if we could change that. So let's implement that. And of course, since we have what you see is what you get, wouldn't it be nice here to have like the actual clock that we have in our play view show up here as well with an input field inside of it? So let's do that. So this is the clock that we have, this divider. So let's go ahead and make a component out of it. So we're going to use a slot here. I've talked about this in the previous video, but we simply put all the content inside of this component. Just like we have our custom button component, everything inside of the tags will be rendered here. So we're gonna put a slot here. Then let's get rid of text3xl, since that doesn't really apply when we have an input field. Otherwise, we just have the same code that we had in our play view. We can in fact actually use this in our play view. We can add a nice little span, and this is what I talked about the slot. This is what we render inside the tags here. So just a simple span with the text3xl, which we had previously. And now we can also use this clock component in our edit question. So this is actually not part of our model yet, but let's add it. So for the quiz question, we also want to have a time, and this will be the time limit for this specific question that the users have to answer it. And let's also add it in our backend, like so. So this is pretty much what I'm thinking. It doesn't look that nice right now since I have such a small window, but if you see, if I enlarge it, we can see that nice little clock. It's actually undefined now since these don't actually have a time limit and the backend hasn't been restarted yet. But what we want to do here is actually use a normal value. So we can't really use bind value here because we want this to be an actual integer value, and the type of this input field is actually text. If I were to make it an input type a number, we can see that we get this really ugly spinner-like component, which doesn't look that good in my opinion. So we're gonna need some custom logic for this, in fact. So we can do something like on change for this. So here is how I define that. On time change, we take in a generic event Then the target, e.target, gives us the target HTML element where this event occurred. We simply cast that as HTML input element, and then we set the time to parse integer from the target value. So I added this time field now to my MongoDB database, and I restarted the server. So here we can see some of the values getting through here. If you haven't added any values to your database, it would still be 0 since Golang has default values. So the default value of an integer is 0 in Golang, so it wouldn't be null, it would simply be defined. It will just be 0. But now I have some values which we can use. I also added this add new button to add a new quiz question. Simple button where we append to our questions array with a new question. We just add a lot of these choices since they actually need to be provided if we want to render them properly. So we have 4 choices, all of them are incorrect. We give them random IDs, different IDs, that is important. And the name here will be an empty string. So you can see that also works. I set the default name here to be question, and I can edit this. The default time for this is 60, which I defined here. So I guess it's time that we actually save this to our backend. So we need to implement that as well. So I defined this save quiz method to our API service, where we take in a quiz ID and a quiz object, and we make a HTTP request to exactly the same thing as we do up here. But this time around it's actually going to be a put request, since we're modifying an existing resource. And here for the body of this HTTP request, we JSON stringify our quiz. And here it's important that we set the content type header, since we're sending off this as JSON. For this to be processable by our backend, we need to set the content type to be application JSON so that it knows to expect that. And if this failed, then we just alert fail to save quiz. And now we can finally use this inside our edit quiz view. So we're gonna send this here in save function. So whenever we run this, we check if quiz isn't null, otherwise we run a save quiz. So of course we need to define this in our backend. We add app.put, since that is the method and the same route. And then we need to define update quiz by ID. So this is how that is going to look. I first define a new struct, in fact, an update quiz request. So we could of course just decode directly into our quiz struct, but then the user could actually edit this ID if they wanted to. They could actually modify the ID. And imagine if we had other important properties here, maybe like a password or something like that. Other important properties that we don't want to be mutable to any outsiders. So here I simply define very strictly what is the client able to change. So we will have to have some manual code, of course, but this is pretty good now since we don't have a lot of fields. If we have a lot of fields, there are some other techniques that we could use. But I just pretty much copy pasted the name and the questions field. And how do we do this? Well, it's very similar to up here. We parse the quiz ID. Then we're going to use something known as the body parser in Fiber. So Fiber actually has a built-in functionality for parsing JSON and XML and I guess a bunch of other types, content types. But here we can actually body parse into an actual struct. It's pretty fascinating. So we can use body parse, and of course, since I talked about this previously, we need to make this sure. We need to make sure this is a reference so that it can actually modify this specific variable that we have here. So we just body parse the incoming request, the incoming body, which is JSON, into this update quiz request struct. And then we call quiz service update quiz, where we send in the name and the questions that the user wants to update. If there's a problem, we return the error, otherwise we return status okay. Then for the update quiz function, well, here we just try to get this quiz by ID first. So if it does not exist, we simply return that error. Otherwise, we take the existing quiz, since we have that object now, and we replace these properties. We replace the name and we replace the questions, and then we call update quiz on quiz collection. And how does this look? Well, here we're going to use some specific MongoDB syntax. So we're going to use the update command to update a document in the collection. Here the first argument is the filter, so we want to get the document where ID equals quiz.id, and then the second here then the second here is actually the update document. So instructing MongoDB how it should do something, and set simply replaces the whole document. There are other things you can do in MongoDB. It's pretty powerful. You could like add to an array or set a specific field like deeply nested and stuff like that. But we simply replace the whole document, and we replace it with this quiz object. So the driver will just simply marshal that and handle it for us. We just need to pass in the object. And this should actually update our quiz in the database. So let's try this out. If I go ahead and add some question marks here and press save, let's see if that is successful. We put that. And if I reload now, we can see, boom, that has been saved into the database. We can know that because we're actually fetching it from the server again. If I were to restart the server, boom, it's persisted. No black magic here. It's actually saved to disk in my database. And we can of course change the quiz name if we want it to be maths instead. Save that, boom, that is also persisted. And all of this is beautifully done with two-way data binding. So I can just add questions and save, and boom, it will just update according to that object, according to that quiz object that I have. Isn't it fascinating how easy that is? So now we pretty much have our quiz editor finished. So let's also add some finishing touches to this project. We currently have this host lobby view, and it looks pretty dull, right? We don't even have the game code shown here. We have to read it from the console, which is really stupid. So we need to have a way to see the game code. And the way I'm going to do this is by actually reusing our host game packet. So this is sent by the host to the server to host a quiz by its ID. But there's no reason we can't just reuse the same packet here, but use the quiz ID as the code instead. So this will be a bi-directional packet. We will send it both ways. Who cares? So whenever we host this, we will simply send that packet to the host as well with the game code that was randomly generated. Now for this to work, we of course need to add it here as a packet ID. It is defined here, right? It's defined here as packet ID 1. So let's add it. And of course it's important that it's the same packet ID, since that's what's going to map in the front end. So host game packet has packet ID 1. So whenever we get a host game packet from the server, we decode that and we set this game code store. So I'm going to add a new store called game code, which will just contain the game code. So this will actually improve our design a little bit, because now we really only go to the host lobby view whenever we have a proper game code to join. If somehow the hosting failed, maybe it was an invalid quiz ID or something, then we would not get a game code back. So instead of this stupid active boolean, we will simply check if game code isn't null, then we render the game. So I also changed up the design here. I added a nice large join with the game code, and even larger I display the game code so that the players who are in the back of the classroom can see it clearly. Then I also added a bit more styling here, so we show how many players have joined, and we also show no players have joined if there are no players who have joined. And this is a fancy little syntax from Svelte. So if there are no elements to iterate over in each loop, we simply use else. So each or else. If there are no elements in the array, we simply show no players have joined. So let's try this. If I try to host this, boom, join with game code. Players, no players have joined yet. Doesn't this look much better? So one thing I'm also thinking of is if a player has disconnected, we are not actually removing them ever. So we need to implement disconnection functionality as well. We can do this here in the controller. So whenever we get an error from read message, that simply means that the connection is faulty or that the player has disconnected. So we can use that. So if there is an error, then we can tell net service that the user has disconnected. So we simply add c net service on disconnect and send in the connection that has disconnected. And that is how this will look. We try to get the game that the player is a part of. If it doesn't exist, we just return. Otherwise, we get that game and we tell the game that that player has disconnected. So here we have that on player disconnect. We send in this player pointer. This looks pretty ugly. We could probably like write a utility function to filter a list, but we just loop over the current game players, and if it is the player that we're trying to remove, we don't add them. Otherwise, we add them to the list, and then we just replace the whole list. We then send a left the game message. So all that remains is to tell the host that a player has disconnected. So we're going to need a new packet for that, a player disconnect. And this is how I will define that. Player disconnect packet. We send the player ID of the player that has disconnected. And of course, we add a new packet ID 10. Let's also add this here to packet types. And as an interface here, player disconnect packet. And then we can use it here in the host game. So when we get the player disconnect, we cast that as player disconnect packet, and then we update our players store. And of course, we also need to send it whenever they leave. So if I try that now, if I host and I try to close this tab, boom, instantly we get that removed and see no players have joined. So let's test the flow a little. If I join here and start the game, what is 2 plus 2? 4, correct. Reveal state. Skip. What is 7 times 5? Well, that is 35, correct. You can see a nice leaderboard. What is 404? Both of these are in fact correct. And these are our dummy choices with nothing correct. So this will be incorrect. So there we have it, game ended. I think it would also be nice here if we added a bit more fancy medals or something. Maybe a little gold icon for the player who won the game or something like that. And something that I just remembered. When we go to the reveal state, if the player has not answered whatsoever, we also need to set that last awarded points to 0. So if they didn't answer at all, they just didn't vote, so to speak, then we set it to 0. So that's like an incorrect answer. That's really important. Otherwise, they will think that they have correctly answered even though they didn't answer at all. And boom, doesn't that look much nicer? So I just added a nice little finish flag. So this, since we are reusing this component for 2 scenarios, we only want to show these medals whenever we are actually in the game end state. So if it is finish and we have less than 3, so if there are like place 5 or 4 or whatever, they won't have any medals. Then we show that medal. And then we have some of the colors here. So we have kind of gold-ish yellow, more yellow than gold. Then we have silver, and then we have BG yellow 700 for a brown color. We can also try this if we do I+1 here. We can see silver here, or the bronze that I came up with. But I guess we actually want to include more than 3 since we still want to show the place that the players had. So if I is less than 3, then we show I, otherwise we show 2. So this will simply show the brown color if they are another place. So if I were to do something like this, maybe it would show the brown color. So yeah, if we had more players, if we had like 4 or 5 or even on, then they would have the brown color but still show the standing on which place they came. So now if I quickly edit this, this has 5 seconds. Let's make this 20 and add 2 choices here, A, B. Let's get rid of this last one. Save that, boom. Then we can go back to host and host it and join it as a player. We can see our name here, players 1, start the game. What is 2 plus 2? That adds 60 seconds. If I do 4 here, boom. Let's see, this should be like 5 seconds. So we have a leaderboard, skip. That should be 5, right? Wasn't that 5? Yeah, we haven't actually set that. We haven't actually set the time limit for the question. So we want to do that in the backend, of course, as well. So when we go to next question, we want to, instead of setting it to 60, we want to do, we want to get the current question and set it to the time. And here we can reuse that for the packet. So let's try that once more. Host this game and try to join it, start it. What is 2 plus 2? That was 55 seconds, so it clearly worked. If I do 4 here, boom, we have a reveal state. That works fine. And we have a leaderboard. No medals or anything. And we skip that. Boom, 5 seconds. I will leave out my answer now. And boom, you can see that it shows incorrect. Nice. And then we see the correct answer. Still leaderboard. What is 404? That was even shorter, maybe. Yeah, it was even shorter. Still incorrect. Let's see if I answer correctly here. That was correct. So now she had pretty much 10,000 points, 11,000. Skip that one and boom, the game ended. And we can see the final standings. We can see that Test won here with 1,072 points. So there we go. That is pretty much what I wanted to implement for this project. That is what I had in mind for my Kahoot clone. I hope you guys enjoyed this series. Of course, if you have any suggestions of anything else you would like to see, some specific features, make sure to comment that. And maybe I will make a compilation video with all of these features and implement them in the game. Feel free to share your projects if you have finished this and made it a thing. That would be really cool to see how your quiz Kahoot clones differ from mine. But feel free to join my Discord channel if you want to be part of the community, and feel free to subscribe. But other than that, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace out.